deadliest wildfire in more than 100 years. A whole city destroyed. Generations of native Hawaiian history turned into ruin.
The whole town was devastated. The whole town was decimated.
The catastrophe caused by the wildfire in Maui could have been avoided. Like recent fires in Colorado and California that between them took scores of lives, there were both natural and man-made factors. Because in addition to the loss of life and widespread destruction, the three had something else in common. Authorities knew that they weren't just possible, they were probable. And yet, they were still underprepared. The wildfires are far from isolated cases. As the global climate changes at an alarming pace, governments, utilities, and plenty of others besides are unprepared for extreme weather events that many had predicted. They share the same failing: risk blindness. Before we get into risk blindness, we need to get to grips with what we know about the Maui disaster. The fire that struck Lahaina on August the 8th blindsided the picturesque waterside town. By mid-August, more than 100 deaths had been recorded and hundreds of people were still missing or unaccounted for. More than 2,000 structures were damaged or destroyed.
Authorities estimate the total damage is at least $5.5 billion, and they expect that number to climb as well.
The utility was aware that wildfires were a risk in the area.
Back in 2019, Hawaiian Electric said that they were going to start identifying areas that its power infrastructure may be vulnerable to wildfire or starting a wildfire, and that included flying drones over its power lines.
By 2022, it had submitted a spending plan to address the risks it had identified. By the time the fire struck, that spending had yet to be approved. The official cause of the fire is still undetermined, as Hawaiian Electric has pointed out. The utility says it is working with officials on the investigation. But preparation for wildfires by both the community and utility was incomplete, even as similar disasters elsewhere in the US heightened concerns.
In Northern California, a PG&E power line broke loose during dry and windy conditions and sparked the Camp Fire, which burned the town of Paradise, resulting in 85 deaths, and at the time was considered one of the deadliest wildfires in U.S. history. We had an incident in Oregon in 2020 where utility lines came down during very gusty winds and sparked a devastating fire there. In 2021, we saw utility lines blamed for a very fast-moving wildfire in Colorado.
In both Colorado and California, there had been earlier warnings about wildfire risks, just as there were in Maui.
There were a lot of things that went wrong to create this fire. There were a combination of natural conditions and a bunch of human-led decisions. And together, that's what resulted in this disaster. So there used to be these plantations, these sugar plantations, but they've been abandoned in recent decades. And so you've had these grasses, these plants kind of grow out of control. They're invasive. They are fuel for fire. And then layer on top of that climate change, which has brought drier, hot, windy days. And so that means you had the climatic conditions to start a fire, and then you had the fuel to kind of perpetuate it. And that's what happened in Lahaina.
There are a number of indications that the fire risk on Maui was increasing. There are a number of government reports indicating that.
The fire was fast, but the response was slow. If it transpires that Hawaiian Electric's equipment didn't start the initial fire, some assert that it could have responded differently.
The big thing utilities can do in the face of a fire is to cut power. That's because power lines themselves can spark further fires or spark new fires. Strong winds can knock down power lines, those can then spark. So if you're cutting off the power, you're cutting off a source of new fire. Hawaiian Electric did not turn off the power, and it's a question of whether they should have, if that would have impacted the water that was available to then fight the fires.
In the case of Hawaii, I think the fire risk is a fairly recent phenomenon. So I think that's something that the government there and the utility has had to react to kind of on a time scale that they're not used to dealing with. Overall, across, say, the United States and the globe, I think what you're seeing is that there's an awareness of the risk, but not a very good understanding of the potential catastrophic consequences that risk isn't addressed quickly and competently.
It's not just utilities or indeed governments. Take the insurance industry. It has been warning about the impact of climate change for decades, yet has only started responding in recent years as the cost of disasters has increased. Natural disasters from 2020 to 2022 caused a record $275 billion in insured losses just in the US. Wildfires, hurricanes, and flooding are prompting insurers to recalibrate their risk exposure.
AIG has pulled out of doing new homeowners insurance in California, and that State Farm and Allstate are taking similar steps. Specifically, the states of California, Louisiana, and Florida are all places where insurers have either gone under or are threatening to pull out or are pulling out at this moment.
The impact of risk blindness on people and industries is long and growing. In many cases, no alternatives have been planned. When rivers dry up, as they do with increasing regularity, global trade suffers as ships struggle to navigate arterial trade routes such as the Mississippi, Panama Canal, and River Rhine. Last year, shipping costs jumped tenfold in some cases, pushing energy and raw material costs higher.
Worsening climate change can also impact the very solutions that were designed can prevent it. Wildfire smoke can dramatically reduce the output of solar panels. Dwindling river levels or water levels can impact nuclear plant outputs as well as hydroelectric power plants.
Running through all of this is what in the business world has become known as risk blindness.
Risk blindness is when people underestimate risk, and that can be because they're looking at the past to try and better understand what's going to happen in the future, or because they're overestimating their ability to respond to a risk.
The way that insurers gauge risk almost codifies the problem.
The insurance industry is largely relied on models and data based on what's happened in the past. If we're only looking at the past, it's going to be wrong because what's happening with climate change is risk is changing.
Europe is making its companies recognize their blindnesses when it comes to climate change. This year, the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive entered into force. Publicly traded companies have to identify financial risks and opportunities arising from climate change.
There are a lot of communities around the world whose risk has grown in the past 10, 15, 20 years. Maybe it's that they have a new or higher risk to wildfire. Maybe it's that they have a higher risk to hurricane or flooding. But Maui's a reminder that risk is growing and that we need to be aware of what our risk is today.